If you can get more, all the better. So cryptozoology was my first thing. But my mom saw a UFO when I was very young, and I remember her telling my dad, and I remember being enthralled by this. So the belief, of course, that there is life in this universe, and that it may be visiting Earth, to me has always been very fascinating and extremely compelling. So then it filters down to that. I've had the hardest time with paranormal stuff, but what I've found is that over the years, the more people I've interviewed, the more my mind has really opened up. I used to want to think, like, say, something like the Mothman, like we were talking about earlier, was either a mistaken bird of some sort that people just kind of saw and got freaked out and it became sort of mass hysteria, or a cryptozoological phenomenon in that it was an unknown animal that happened to be in the area. But the more I've researched it and the more I've talked to people that actually saw some of these things and gotten deeper, the more I think not everything can be described as unknown animals or extraterrestrial. Some things are just so strange that they just defy all conventional logic. And so in my old age, I find that I'm opening up to the possibility that just this world can be a sort of nexus where things from I don't know where can come through, and they don't have to fit into the conventional rules of biology or physics. They can do some really crazy, disturbing things. And in some ways, that, as I get older, has become some of the most fascinating cases that we tackle. And in a lot of ways, it's the most terrifying because it is inherently the least logical.
I know, but I always say that maybe some of these creatures are coming out from another dimension. We don't even know, or through a portal. I mean, it can go time shift or whatever. I mean,
one of my partners, Mark Storrs, I talked about earlier, one of the guys that co-founded Cryptopia.us with me, and is one of the podcasters that I do Cryptonaut podcast with. He absolutely adores the interdimensional theory. And I cannot have a case with him where he doesn't talk about it, but he's absolutely right in one sense, that I'm fascinated by the thought. There's a woman that we interviewed that lives in Watertown, New York, where she swears there are these vortices in this park area where she has encountered these Adonis-like beings and these fairy-type creatures. And once upon a time, I would have poo-pooed it out of hand, but now I take these stories and I catalog them where they go because I'm like, you just don't know. Reality is so complex. And if you can read a little bit about quantum mechanics or string theory and have that rattle your brain, then why not portals to other dimensions? Why not things that are just as indigenous to Earth as we are, but they live in a different level of it? And not level in terms of underground or in the stratosphere, but level in terms of a dimensional barrier. I don't know if you remember, if you ever saw the old 80s horror film From Beyond. It was based on an H.P. Lovecraft story directed by Stuart Gordon. But in this world, this scientist in this movie developed a machine that enabled us to see these creatures that coexisted with us, but that weren't aware of us and we weren't aware of them. And they basically were like these horrible, toothy, skull-like eels that were floating around, and then once they actually saw you, could attack you. And of course, it's this really, over-the-top horror film, classic 80s stuff. But that thought has always kind of been in my head, like, what if we are constantly surrounded by these phantasmagoric creatures that are either maybe terrifyingly predatorial or these beautiful nymphs or any number of things that they don't see us and we don't see them. They're existing on just a slightly shifted plane, but that they're right here with us all the time. And that possibility to me just fills me with this endless series of images, fears, and hopes, but also it just excites the sense of wonder, like childlike wonder in me.
Well, there used to be a person who did a lot of experimenting with high-speed digital and film that used to come on a talk show and talk about it, that he would see these like creatures like from that movie you were talking about. He would capture it on, high-speed film that, you normally wouldn't even see it at the normal speed. We're talking really high speed. And maybe things like that do exist, but we just don't see it. We can't see it.
I mean, I've always been fascinated with things like rods, which are these supposedly tubular super fast cryptids that have
Right.
multiple series of wings like a dragonfly and legs. Some people think they're insects. Some people think they're just tricks of photography that kind of create the illusion of them. But that to me is even something, another thing altogether, in the sense that wouldn't it be fascinating if, not even on another dimension, but in our world itself, there are things that just move so fast they can't register, but with technology we might be able to, kind of like this photographer, capture these just fleeting moments of their reality. And that's fascinating too, plus the idea of atmospheric monsters. I've written articles about that, again, for Cryptopia and Mysterious Universe, and we've done podcasts about that before. The idea that these weird, amorphous, almost like super amoebas kind of exist floating in the atmosphere. Some people mistake them for UFOs, according to different people that have reported them. They've been studied by scientists that are only, of course, speculating about their existence because they're so ephemeral that if they do exist, there's not a lot of tangible evidence, except that sometimes they come to the ground in the form of like that star jelly or that weird goop that sometimes lands on a community and no one can quite figure out what it is. But I don't know, like, I'm not saying that I support that their existence 100%, but in the course of my research, you think to yourself, how fascinating would it be if somewhere between space and the atmosphere that's, keeping us safe, there was a whole cavalcade of these really membranous, almost invisible creatures that just we don't have any real reason to interact with on a common basis. And the world is probably chock full of things like that, particularly, as we were talking earlier, in the oceans.
Oh, I wouldn't doubt that at all. Now, I want to step back. I don't know if you know who Mary Joyce is. She runs a website. It's called SkyshipsOverCashiers.com. Now, it is a reporting center for UFOs, Bigfoot, Earth changes, and things that we're talking about right now. Back to 2 months back when she was on, because she comes on once a month to do an hour report. She was talking about when they were building a new community college in North Carolina, and I can't remember the name of the town it was at. They found skeletons about 6 inches tall, humanoid. And the local college had them, and all of a sudden, they were shipped off to Washington, D.C. for some reason, and that was the end of it. But she has pictures of them, and it's interesting. We're talking about skeletons of whatever, humanoid, about 6 inches long. Now, are they leprechauns? Are they fairies? What are they?
That's a great question. I am so fascinated by things like this. I know from South America a lot of times there are miniature humanoid skeletons. Some get, DNA tested and it's discovered they're like spider monkeys, but others really resist classification. And some of them have strange shaped skulls, really, really unique things. And that's the thing. Do they represent, a lot of people think they represent extraterrestrials that came here and for whatever reason, be it the environment, whatever it could be, passed away, and these are their remains. Other people think that they're kind of like Homo floresiensis, the hobbits that were discovered on the island of Flores near Sumatra some years ago, an extinct proto-species of humanoid that lived, in an isolated environment and had dwarfism because of it. So the thought to me that there are very tiny humanoid creatures that are basically ancestors, or at least somehow linked to us genetically, is not beyond the pale. Now, 6 inches, that's pretty extreme. I mean, that's dwarfism to a massive extreme. But could they exist? Could they have existed in the past? It's possible. It would have to be very few, because obviously the fossil remains are almost non-existent. And then there's the other theory, like you're saying, could these be the wee folk that people talk about? This is really interesting to me, because there was, of course, the great old French ufologist Jacques Vallée, who wrote like Passport to Magonia and many other great books. And at first he was a traditional ufologist in the sense that I think he was completely bought into the extraterrestrial theory, but he started exploring more and more the relationship between fairy encounter stories from times, times of yore where people were abducted by little people and they were flying on these sky ships and all of these things that he realized were essentially alien encounter stories, but told from the perspective of 100, 200, 300 years ago, and their perspective on technology and culture. To them, these were just other creatures that lived in a different plane of existence, or that sometimes people would slip through these portals and then come back what they thought was 5 hours later, but it ended up being a year later on Earth, which of course is what Einstein would describe as relativity issues, that, when you travel fast enough, you don't age, but the things that you left behind did. So I found his research to be really fascinating in the idea that this is a phenomenon that has been with the human race for as long as there's been a human race, but it's just identified differently depending on which cultural perspective we have and what we're bringing to the table. Now it's technology, so we think of it in terms of UFOs and a highly technological advanced race from somewhere else. But once upon a time, it's fairy folk from the glade, and maybe some of these skeletons represent this very real part of human history that gets reinterpreted down through the ages differently by every time and period and everyone based on their perspective who lives in said time period.
Well, I say this, okay? The Finks, okay? They recently said the wear marks on the back of the Finks predated. Mm-hmm. They, for scientists for years said, well, those wear marks on the back of the Finks is caused by sand erosions. Well, they have now come to the conclusion, no, it was caused by water. That now puts the Finks before mankind. And that makes me really seriously wonder if you go back to prehistoric, you go back to whatever, okay? In the caves, the drawings like of men with a helmet on or men flying. Why would prehistoric or back at that time, would they think men could fly in some type of contraption? They wouldn't even think of that. It would be something that would be totally not thinkable. So it makes me wonder, where did we all come from, and how many different species of humanoid, or what, not even just humanoid, species of animals that were on this planet that maybe resembled humans in a way, and they died off, and the humans survived.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
So what fascinates me, just as a member of the human race, is how many species of proto-human, and like you say, possibly other animals that had a kind of co-divergent evolution that were very humanoid that are gone. I think there's scads of them, and the thing is, there's, especially nowadays, we have like satellite archaeology, and we have all sorts of technology that allows us to dig deeper and deeper. There's always something that they say, this changes everything, and I think that's going to happen more and more in the near future. What I'm fascinated by is the limitations. Let's deal with civilization first and foremost. The limitations that they think we have on civilization. At first, the oldest things were pyramids, of course, cave paintings. And then, of course, they discovered Göbekli Tepe. And it's like, oh, this was supposed to be when we were still, pre-agricultural, just traveling nomadic people, chasing herds of elk and whatever, and subsisting off the land. But here you have these brilliant, beautiful places of worship carved in stone with kind of these. It's interesting that it's basically a menagerie of animals in an area where Noah's Ark was said to land, but I'll leave that for whatever interpretation people want to make to it. What I think is that the human race, and maybe other species before the human race, have gone through cycles of civilization much more profound and much older than we can imagine. I mean, I'm talking hundreds of thousands of years. We basically think civilization, or at least we're taught that civilization goes back 10,000 years, give or take, to the max. Before that, we are basically, like say, living hand to mouth, forging, carving things into rocks occasionally, rock walls, and throwing spears at big, hairy, megafauna. But I really think that we've had other points of high civilization. Now, maybe they use technologies different than what we know now. Maybe they weren't electric-based, and maybe they didn't have an internet as we know it. Maybe they used magnetic power. Maybe it was ley lines. And maybe they were more in tune with the earth and did things in ways that we can't quite wrap our minds around. But I really think that the better the archaeology gets, the more likely we are to find evidence of truly, truly ancient civilizations, some of which